What if I told you that perfectionist tendencies are often developed from narcissistic abuse? The pressure to be flawless often stems from growing up in an environment where nothing was ever good enough. If you've been a victim of narcissistic abuse, you may have unknowingly learned to tie your self-worth to meeting impossible standards. Today, let's talk about how narcissistic abuse victims develop perfectionist tendencies. Does this hit the mark for you? Are you ready for number 1? Praise was conditional. Narcissistic abuse often involves conditional praise. The kind that's given only when you make a great achievement that makes the narcissist look great. It messes with your head and wires you to believe love, acceptance, and praise are only for the perfect version of yourself, the one who meets impossible standards. This leads to perfectionism, where nothing you do ever feels good enough. As Dr. Kristin Neff, a self-compassion expert, says, perfectionism is about self-criticism masked as striving for excellence. When you grow up in an environment like that, you learn to chase perfection as a way to survive, not realizing it's actually making things worse. It becomes a toxic loop of needing approval while never feeling secure in who you are. Let's talk about number 2. They were made the golden child, or the scapegoat. If you were the golden child or the scapegoat, you probably know the weight of unrealistic expectations all too well. You might have been put on a pedestal and expected to be flawless or blamed for everything and made to feel worthless. Either way, both roles are like being stuck in a never-ending performance. You start to believe that your worth is based on what others think of you, and that leads to perfectionism. Psychologist Dr. David Burns calls it the tyranny of the shoulds, where you're constantly telling yourself that you're not good enough unless you hit certain marks, either to please others or avoid their wrath. No matter what, you're always trying to prove your worth, and that's a surefire way to develop perfectionist tendencies. Let's move on to number 3. They had to manage the narcissist's emotions. If you've ever felt like you were constantly walking on eggshells just to keep the peace, that's what happens when you're managing a narcissist's emotions. You start learning to predict every mood shift, hoping if you do everything perfectly, maybe they won't blow up. But here's the catch. No matter how much you adjust, they still explode. And it leaves you feeling like you're never in control. This hypervigilance is a breeding ground for perfectionism. As Dr. Sherry Campbell, a psychologist, explains, when you are constantly trying to manage someone else's emotional state, you lose touch with your own needs and constantly feel inadequate. But since it's never actually about you, it fuels a perfectionist mindset to control everything to keep the peace even when it's impossible. Now, let's continue to number 4. They were taught mistakes equals catastrophe. In a narcissistic household, mistakes aren't seen as learning opportunities but as a disaster. If you messed up, you weren't taught how to fix it or grow from it. Instead, you were made to feel like a failure. So, naturally, you start fearing mistakes with every ounce of your being. As a result, you embrace perfectionism. You believe if you can be flawless, maybe you won't face the same harsh judgment. Psychologist Dr. Jennifer Gutman explains, when we live in constant fear of making mistakes, we avoid risk and stifle personal growth, which makes perfectionism seem like the only way to stay safe. But what ends up happening is that perfectionism becomes your emotional security blanket. something you hold on to protect yourself from the emotional fallout of making a mistake. You shouldn't miss number 5. They internalized the belief that they're too much or not enough. If you've ever felt like you can't win no matter what you do, that's probably because of the constant mixed signals narcissists love to throw your way. One minute you're too much, too emotional, too loud or too demanding, and the next you're not enough. Not pretty enough, not caring enough, or not trying hard enough. Dr. Susan Forward, author of Emotional Blackmail, says that narcissists thrive on this kind of emotional chaos, leaving their victims feeling perpetually insecure. And you start chasing this imaginary, perfect version of yourself that can never be achieved because the goalposts keep moving. You try to be just the right amount of everything, but in the end, perfection becomes an illusion, a desperate attempt to escape the feeling of being too much or not enough. Are you still up for number 6? They were punished for being themselves. You might have been ridiculed for being too quirky or just different in any way. Narcissists are experts at making you feel like who you are isn't enough. So you start hiding behind a perfect, polished version of yourself, one that's acceptable, safe, and less likely to trigger their wrath. As Dr. Laura Berman, a relationship expert, puts it, when we suppress our true selves to fit in, we lose our sense of authenticity, which leads to anxiety and self-doubt. You become a master of perfectionism, trying to present a flawless version of yourself to protect against rejection or ridicule, all while losing touch with the very qualities that made you unique in the first place. Let's keep it moving to number 7. They were shamed publicly and often. If you've ever been publicly shamed or humiliated, you know it's not just the moment that stings, it stays with you. Narcissists are experts at making you feel small, often humiliating you in front of others to assert control. As psychotherapist Dr. John Amadeo says, shame makes us hide who we are, even from ourselves. This often leads to perfectionism because you think if you can just do everything right, you can avoid that awful feeling of being exposed. But the problem is, even when there's no real threat, the echo of that shame lingers in your mind. It makes you feel like you're always one mistake away from being put on blast again. And it's this constant self-monitoring that fuels perfectionism. It's like trying to outrun a shadow that was never really yours to begin with. Here comes number 8. They mistook compliance for safety. Psychologist Dr. Sherry Campbell explains, perfectionism often masks the deeper issue of codependency, where a person's self-worth becomes tied to the approval of others. The need to please the narcissist becomes so ingrained that it turns into an automatic response. The more perfectly you comply, the safer you feel. But the problem is, it's not real safety. It's an illusion, and you end up losing yourself in the process. Perfectionism and compliance become a way to survive emotionally, even though it keeps you from truly living your own life. Moving on to number 9. They were emotionally parentified. If you were forced to take on adult responsibilities as a kid, then you likely grew up way too fast. You became the emotional caretaker before you even knew how to take care of yourself. And now, as an adult, that need to perform never really goes away. Therapist Dr. Lindsay C. Gibson explains, emotionally parentified children often carry the burden of perfectionism because they feel responsible for everyone's well-being. Now, Every mistake feels like you're letting everyone down, even if it's just that younger part of you still carrying all that old hurt. Finally, we're down to number 10. They want to prove the narcissists wrong. Narcissists often target their victims with cruel words, calling them weak, stupid, or lazy. And over time, those insults get stuck in your head. As Dr. Jonas Webb, a psychologist and author of Running on Empty, explains, the emotional abuse that comes from narcissism creates deep feelings of inadequacy, which victims try to cover up with perfectionism. This becomes an unconscious drive to prove you're not what they said you were. The truth is, your perfectionism was never about you being too much or not enough. It was about the surviving in a place that made you feel unsafe. Now that you see where it really came from, you can start giving yourself permission to be human, not perfect. Healing starts when you realize you were always worthy, even when the people around you couldn't see it.